and our assembly is devoted to Black history. And it's devoted to Black history because Black history is American history. And I'd like to read a particular passage from this book, from this project called 1619 Project, and so that you understand that Black history is really very much part of American history. The author of this book and the project, called Nicole Hannah Jones, says, Black Americans never fought only for themselves. The freedom struggles for the civil rights movement laid the foundation for every modern rights struggle. The laws born out of Black resistance guarantee the franchise for all and ban discrimination based not just on race, but also on gender, nationality, religion, and ability. No one cherishes freedom more than those who have not had it. That's an important statement by Nicole Hannah Jones. And today, to be able to reflect about that, we have invited a very distinguished speaker, and that's Mr. Neil Foote. Let me tell you a little bit about him. Mr. Foote is Associate Dean of Research, External Affairs and Community Engagement at the University of North Texas in Frisco. He's Principal Lecturer of the UNT Mayborn School of Journalism. He's Director of the nationally acclaimed Mayborn Literary Nonfiction Conference. And his career and dedication to diversifying newsrooms recently earned him induction into the Hall of Fame of the National Association of Black Journalists. He obtained his MBA from SMU, and he's been a reporter for a range of newspapers, including Miami Herald, Washington Post, and the Dallas Morning News. So, without further ado, let me introduce and let us all welcome Mr. Foote.
Good morning. Bonjour. Buenas. Je parle un peu français, alors un poquito de español. I studied French and Spanish in high school, so you good? Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It's an honor for me to be here today. Thanks to my former colleague Jim Dale, who immediately called when he was putting the program together to invite me to be here with me. So I am excited to talk to you about storytelling, and the title of my conversation today with you all, and if you have questions, we'll save some time at the end if you have questions, okay? Is to talk about not only my story, because as I was sharing with some of your teachers earlier about my journey as a journalist and a storyteller began right around your age. And I want to walk you through kind of my journey as wanting to be a journalist and a writer. And then I want to introduce you to some of the people that I've been able to meet along the way, all who have been influential history makers in some way or the other in this country. And then I'll introduce you to some other journalists, some in the local area who have been newsmakers and history makers to themselves. And if we have time, talk about some of the things that you might be able to do to help tell your story. That sound good?
Yeah.
Good. All right. Excellent. Excellent. All right. So Black History Month really is something that it started out as a week almost 100 years ago, believe it or not, when Dr. Woodson realized in his research that the history of Black folks in America was missing, of African Americans and Africans in history was missing. And so he worked with a number of other historians around the country to start a week to raise attention to the importance of the contributions of Blacks to this country's history. I can tell you, as part of one of my stories, that I had great aunt Edna. She was, at the time, she seemed like she was 100, but she was probably in her 70s, right? But she had a house in the Bronx, New York, and on her wall, if you can imagine, on her wall, she had pictures, just dozens and dozens of pictures. And great aunt Edna was a storyteller. If you came into her house, particularly as one of her young nephews, she would go to the wall and she would say, "You know who this is?" And she would tell the story about an uncle or a cousin who may have fought in the Revolutionary or Civil War, and their roots, where he may have come from Europe and how he had settled in the U.S. That became a great grounding for me in many different ways. So if we look at that, this is my father here off to the left, and this is me. Picture you can't see too well, but that's me with a bunch of fish that I had caught. My dad was a fisherman, and as a young man, as a young kid, he would take me out fishing. And you will hear stories about fishermen as storytellers. And the funny thing about fishermen and their stories is sometimes they're real, and sometimes they're fishy. Right? Bad fun, right? But my father loved to tell stories, and I remember as a young kid when he first started taking me out fishing, he had a group of buddies. He would go out fishing all year round, and he had this group of guys every Saturday, sometimes every Sunday they'd go out. When they first started bringing me, they were like, "Oh, Neil," they used to go like that, "why are you bringing your kid? Come on, he's just going to get in the way." Well, by the time, the fifth or sixth time, they were bringing me snacks, they were bringing me lifesavers. If I got a little seasick, they were extremely worried about me. And I began hearing their stories. And that inspired me in so many ways about the tales that they would give. They would talk about, certainly, their fishing tales, which from time to time varied, right? Because these were fishermen telling fishing tales. They would talk about their time that they'd spent in the war, whether that was World War I or World War II. But these were distinguished men who inspired me, really, the heart and true essence of storytelling. My home here in Brooklyn, New York, this is where I grew up in the brownstone that my family still has. I have two older sisters. We still live in the brownstone, we grew up in. Since renovated over the years, but my grandfather bought that house in the 30s during the Depression, and it's been in the family for almost 80 years now. And so my two older sisters, my niece, her husband, and their little over 1-year-old son lived there, so that's really a big part of the culture. I grew up in a community called Bedford-Stuyvesant, which was an interesting story. Is another part of your story, because what I want you all to think about today as I'm talking is your own journeys, your own stories, your own family stories. I told you about my great aunt Edna. I never knew my grandparents because they had passed by I only knew my grandfather on my father's side, but everyone else had passed, so I didn't enjoy that rich history. So as you think about your own family, your sisters, your aunts, your uncles, if you have grandparents, I know sometimes it may be kind of hard to listen to them, but enjoy them. Enjoy them. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But Bed-Stuy, when I grew up, was considered a very bad neighborhood. In fact, as I grew up, someone said, why? Oh, yes. Okay, why? Oh, good question. Well, why? Because it would seem that there was a lot of in the news all the time. There were stories about crime, people getting killed and robbed, and that kind of thing. But not on my block. This block that I lived on was full of many families who looked out after each other. But because of its reputation of being a bad neighborhood, it carried on with me as I grew up in life, and even as I interviewed for jobs. Because people would come up to me when I interviewed for jobs, in addition to, well, why do you want this job? What's your experience? When they got to, well, where are you from? I would say, well, Bed-Stuy. And they would say, oh my goodness. How did you get out of there? I'd say, how did I get out of there? Well, my dad had a car. I knew how to take the bus. They told me how to take the subway, so how did I get out of there? That became something that, as I heard that as a young person, as a young black male, as a young black professional, insulted me because, yes, it was prejudice. It was kind of, well, how can you judge me that way? When my father, as you saw, was a mechanical engineer who worked for some of the biggest companies and traveled around the world. My mom would work out of the house and raised myself and my two older sisters who were hugely successful and really had a wonderful presence. So nowadays, if you talk about Bed-Stuy, it's one of the highest, it has some homes that are some of the wealthiest and most expensive in New York. So things have changed. But back in the day, sometimes you may want to think about this, is that we define sometimes, particularly how we walk into a room and how people perceive us. And so even around this young age as you are, I had to remind myself of who I was, why I was important, and why my father would quite often remind me. He said, Cornelius, when you wake up every morning, you look in the mirror and you believe in yourself. So never let anyone judge you for what you are. Clearly, I didn't let any of those people who said, where are you from? Because I worked at the Miami Herald, I worked at the Washington Post, I worked at the Dallas Morning News. I've had a chance, as you will learn, to meet some of the most fascinating people in the world. I traveled around the world to Spain, and France, and Greece, and Austria, and Amsterdam. So, a wonderful life, and you all are just beginning to share that. Never let anyone define you that way. Some of the famous people from Bed-Stuy, some of you may know. This guy here, Jay-Z. You've heard of Jay-Z? Well, I'll just say that's Beyonce's husband, right? You've heard of Beyonce, right? Who? Yeah, I've never heard of her either. But he grew up in Bed-Stuy. Okay, that's exciting. Spike Lee, who's won an Academy Award several years and produced so many films. He has, in fact, his studios are right there in Bed-Stuy, and he often will be hanging out at a cafe, and people will come up to him and chit-chat. And the woman who my family often talked about was Nina Holmes. And she grew up, she was born in 1917, right around the time of my parents, and she grew up in the same neighborhood as my parents and my aunt. And they talked about her as being this kind of shy young lady who went off to high school and then went off to college a little bit, and then she was discovered by her singing and her acting and went on to become one of the nation's most famous singers in the country from Bed-Stuy. And then many others along the way. This is a little bit more about my family, and it goes to who are the people in your family. I mean, and this again, you may not seem like it's important now because it didn't, when I was your age, seem to mean anything until now, of how significant Dr. Leonard H.B. Foote was. And he was Uncle Leonard for me. And Uncle Leonard, quite honestly, used to get in big arguments with my family and my father and my aunt. And I never knew his significance until later in life. This was in the 20s, he went to medical school. In the 30s and 40s, he began to lay the groundwork at Florida A&M University, and there was a college then in Tallahassee, Florida. And as a medical doctor there, he created not only a teaching hospital, he met his wife, Aunt Hilda, who then created a nursing school. And so if you go visit Florida A&M University now, one of the nation's most popular and hugely successful with its graduates, you will find the Foote Hillier Administration Building, and that Foote is my great uncle. And so it's so much fun when I meet people who have gone to Florida A&M and I tell them, guess who my great uncle was? So you never know who is in your family. So if you can enjoy their storytelling, and even if it's, you might want to try this with your family, your grandparents, and your aunts and uncles. Tell me a story. Tell me a story. And write it down or because I wish I had done and recorded some of those stories, because those become so much a part of who you are. The stories that you pass along to your family and your friends. My daughter, who's now 30, asks me so often about some of these stories that I have to consult with my sisters, and we have to kind of pull together and thread themes of things that we learned about. So this is my first book. I told you that I love to write and I love to read. Home Sweet Home. In France? Really? Oh, that's great. That's wonderful. I used to have a French teacher in high school. So I took French for 5 years, and we also used to ask Madame Davis to tell us stories about growing up in Paris during the World War II. But my first book here began my journey as a storyteller. This was before, I'll show you the next one when I got my first typewriter, but this was just a simple little story, which we all can tell. I was a happy-go-lucky kid, about a happy-go-lucky kid at home, who then went off to his grandmother's house. And then when I was picked up, I was so glad to be home because I loved home so much. When I got my typewriter around 6th grade or so, one Christmas, me and one of my classmates wrote our first book using our typewriter, and it was a sci-fi book called Mystery in Space. And you see some of the expert graphics here, right? Please, right? That's why I chose writing, not graphics, right? And even the table of contents that talked about some astronauts, because I was really into astronomy, and I thought maybe one day, maybe I might be an astronaut or an astronomer. And it talked about these astronauts who go off into space and they get lost in space, but then they kind of safely return home. But that was where my storytelling as a journalist and my passion about writing began. And so that's where, again, typewritten, complete with typos and everything else, and these handwritten graphics. Andre Martineau, my buddy in class, who in class around your age, wrote this book. So how did this kind of manifest itself, right? You say, well, you did that in middle school, so what's that have to do with you now and why you became a journalist? Well, I love to write. I love to read. What's that? Nah. The only published version of it is one that I found in a folder. Yeah, I have this old folder that I'm sure my wife has been wanting me to throw out for years. It has all my old memorabilia, so I've had this in that folder. No one else ever saw that. Just me and my friends and my family. And now you. Oh, that's right. That's right. I could maybe you give me an idea. You guys want to help me do the better graphics for this book? Yeah? All right. Well, I may need to hire you to help me out with that. You can draw. Excellent. Well, I offer this to you that you should come up with your own book. Now you got graphic tools that I don't even have, obviously. But you should do that, right? So my story goes back to writing in high school. I went to school in Brooklyn, New York, to a French school called Brooklyn French School, which again, in my story, in my family history, I went there, my niece went there, my 2 sisters have been working there for almost 30 years, so it's become part of our family history. I love sports. Any of you like sports? Yeah. I played soccer, I played softball. That's about as far as I went. I did baseball too. But I love sports so much, I read every sports thing I could. Because my family said, well, if we want you to read, so I read about football, baseball, hockey, everything I could get my hands on. And so I started writing this column in the Life monthly newspaper for my high school that I did sports predictions, and then went off to school in Connecticut, and where I wrote for the college newspaper all sorts of stories. And when I went off to college, the key thing was, well, what would I do with all these things that I wanted to write about. So the good news is my writing in high school and working for the college newspaper. You guys have a little newsletter or anything?
Email.
Email? Okay, good. So, yeah, these people along the way, I'm going to kind of transition to some of the people who influenced me that I met were history makers. That, again, I didn't realize were history makers at the time, right? So Shirley Chisholm, any of you heard of Shirley Chisholm? You have? Excellent. Excellent. You have not? Let me tell you about the late Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm. I met her because my aunt, the late, she died many years ago, but she was very much involved in public relations in and around the city of New York. And so the Congresswoman, this was in the 1970s, so a long time ago, she came by one of the parks because we lived in her district. She was a Caribbean woman who educated herself, came to the U.S. here, ran for Congress, and became the first elected black woman to the U.S. Congress. On top of that, in the mid-70s, she decided to run for the President of the United States. So, she, again, the challenges she faced as a black woman, the challenges she faced in the changing times of the turbulent times of coming out of the 60s and the 70s, made it really hard. But she became this really vocal advocate for the rights of women and blacks. Yes? She ran against, at the time, Richard Nixon was running for president at the time, and several others who were opposite her. She was very democratic, and it was very, the country at the time was very conservative. Yes? You had a question?
Yes, she gave a lot of votes.
She didn't get a lot of votes, because here's what's part of the troubling part about history, right? You heard a little bit earlier about the 1619 Project and Nicole Hannah-Jones, who I've had a chance to meet. Her book chronicles the journey and the challenges and the pain and the joy of blacks in this country. And at the time, this nation was not ready for a black person running for president of the United States. And so she faced extreme prejudice from people within her own party, and for many people around the country, because, remember I tell you about that story where people ask me, where did you come from? Same thing for her. They did not think she was right for the country. Yes? She fought hard for improving housing, improving our parks in this area in Brooklyn, particularly in Bed-Stuy. She fought to make sure that our public schools got the funding that we needed. So she she wrote several books, and there's even some documentaries out there on Google, you can search on YouTube that can tell you a little bit more about her life. Chuck Stone. Chuck Stone, you may not have heard. You have a question, yes?
I know one of her relatives.
Hmm?
I know one of her relatives.
You do? You want to share Chisholm's relatives? Kathleen Chisholm? Okay. All right. Very good. Excellent. But Chuck Stone was a huge mentor for me because Chuck Stone was a graduate from my college, Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut. As I said, I was a journalist. I was writing for the school newspaper. I wanted to get a job in newspapers. So I went to the alumni office and I asked them, can you give me the name of everyone who works in journalism who's a graduate from my university? I wrote a note. Again, there was no email back then. There were no cell phones. So I had to I wrote a typewritten letter that I mailed Mrs. Stone, who lived in Philadelphia. And then one day in my room, my phone rang, and there was Chuck Stone. And Chuck Stone had been one of the first black students at Wesleyan in the 1950s. He was the first, and at the time, was the first black editor of the Wesleyan Argus that I had become the co-editor of almost 50 years later. And Chuck, his legacy was important not only to me because he invited me to his home. He recommended me to some folks at the Miami Herald that eventually led me to getting my first job. But his career he was a passionate advocate for those who were in prison and wrongly accused. So he began to write columns and did his own research to help some people who were wrongfully accused and jailed to get out of jail, long before some of the projects you hear about now. Yes?
Was he helping with other people that were not guilty? Well, they were actually guilty, but since they were telling the truth, they were just to not be guilty.
That's right. Yeah. So they were arrested and placed in jail, and he did his research. He worked with attorneys and found out that they ended up retrying some of these individuals and getting them out of prison. So pretty cool stuff. So he was someone who in my life became influential in my career, and even when he began teaching journalism in North Carolina, he invited me down there to speak one of his classes. So it was a true honor to know him. That's a little bit about the newspapers that I worked with over the years. And let me talk about some of the other pioneers and people I've met over the years. Sound good? Thanks for your questions. I appreciate it. This interesting? This good? We learning about some new people? Good. So this guy, Tom Joyner, is really significant. You probably never have seen his face. Your parents may have heard his voice because he was on radio in Dallas for more than 35 years until he retired in 2019. And Tom Joyner was known as the fly jock. What does that mean? So Tom, he grew up in Tuskegee, Alabama in the 60s as he calls himself, a young chubby kid who loved to eat and he loved to talk. And so his parents said, well, that's what you need to be doing. And finally in college, when he was at Tuskegee, he got a chance to get on the radio station. And then he got into radio because every day he would go to the local radio station in Tuskegee and complain that they weren't playing any black music. He went every day until finally they hired him. He said, I'll do it. Finally, the owner of the station said, okay, Tom, you do this. You have your show. You got a show. And so that became his legacy. And I got a chance to work with him because at the time that what he was trying to do, about 20 years ago, he wanted to launch a national black newspaper to tell the stories about what was going on with African Americans in this country. I came on and helped him instead of a newspaper, because newspapers were kind of in shaky ground back in 2000. We launched a website called blackamericaweb.com. Yes? You have a question?
I was going to ask what the website was.
Oh, there you go.
What did you put on the website? Was it like an online newsletter?
Yeah, good question. So what was on the website was, all sorts. We had news stories, we had feature stories, we had videos. We began even though it was early on, we had videos, we had quizzes, and other contests, and whatever he was doing on the radio show. And his radio show was so popular, he reached 8 million people every week. He was passionate about making sure people voted. So he did voter registration drives. He traveled around the country, hosting some of the most famous acts around the country, and he would do shows in the morning to get people registered to vote. You had a question, then I'll come to you.
Does the website still exist?
It sure does. That was your question?
Yeah.
Oh, right. Yes, it does. Yes.
You said like posting on there?
Well, not anymore, but I used to be responsible for making sure all the content got on the site. So, his impact, again, in so many ways, helped me understand the power of being a storyteller. Right? Because what he was able to do on his radio show every day was empower and engage and educate his listeners. You know what his phrase was? He had a slogan called "Party with a Purpose." You like that? Party with a purpose? So he was like, hey, we can laugh, we can joke, we can have fun, but we need to take care of action. So let's get people registered to vote. Let's educate people on the issues of our times so that they can make good decisions and learn about what was going on. So I ended up working for him in one way or the other for almost 19 years, and that opened the door for me to meet so many different people over the years. This guy. Yes. So back in 2004, thank you. So back in 2004, I had organized Tom Jordan to meet in Boston at the Democratic National Convention. And in 2004, no one knew who Barack Obama was. Nobody knew who he was. He was some scrawny guy, as he will tell you the story, scrawny guy with a funny name, who during that convention made a speech that actually put him on the radar. And so I was helping really get Tom settled and set up, and I happened to be walking through the corridors of the Foote Arena where he was about to give his speech that night. And I was just literally head down on my phone trying to get things done, and I look up, and there he is with one other person. Remember, in 2004, he was nobody. He was just with one other person. His aide said, oh, you have a camera around next, you want to take a picture with him? I said, sure. Little did I know that he would become the next, several years later, President of the United States. So again, that opportunity happened because of that engagement with Tom Jordan, putting me in a position to meet folks like him. You had a question? You got it?
He was elected in
2008. 2008, yes. So that was 2004 when I met him, and he was just running for U.S. Senator, which he won that election. But the other funny story about it, right? No one knew about him, but I flew to Chicago to meet my family, right? Barack Obama was on the same, plane that I was, sitting in the back of the plane, just like anyone else, just hanging out, and just being kind of a gracious gentleman before he became, rose to the presidency. Yes. Yeah, no, I cherish that picture. That's why I'm like, it's one of my favorite pictures and experiences in the world, right? Because what happened was, as he ran for president, Tom Jordan was passionate, right, about getting the nation's first black president elected. So one of the things I worked with Tom Jordan to help him travel around the country, particularly on the eve of the 2008 election, to visit all the spots that Barack Obama visited. So on one weekend, we flew from Dallas to Indiana to Las Vegas and then back to Dallas, just so Tom could see and be with Tom. On election night, election morning, we were in Chicago at his campaign headquarters, and that night we were right there in Grant Park when the election was announced. So part of history, part of my story, part of the nation's story, in many different ways. It was years later that I got a chance to meet this other one. Do you know who she is? There you go. So she was here in Dallas as First Lady when one of the Food Network shows was actually filming here. And as you know, Michelle Obama, the First Lady, was passionate about health food. And one of their segments was at a local elementary school where they were promoting healthy food. And Tom was part of that, and I got a chance to meet her there. So again, Michelle Obama, growing up in Chicago, hardworking family, went up to some of the best institutions of higher learning and law school, a successful attorney, And again, is now part of that woven journey in my life as she is in yours. Yes?
When you took the picture when Barack Obama already married
Yes. Yeah. So they work together at this event. So I've never met them in the same room, just separately at different events. And she, again, like Barack again was no one at the time, probably doesn't know who I am at all. The First Lady may recognize me probably. All right? Reverend Jesse Jackson, do you guys know who that person is? You do? Not related to Michael Jackson, but Reverend Jesse Jackson in the 1960s was a huge civil rights advocate. He fought for voting rights, he fought for equality, he fought around this country. He ran for president 3 different times in this country, and actually did get a fair amount of votes a couple of years. And he's based out of Chicago now, and his push organization does a lot of community organizing, helping the homeless, helping people get food, helping register people to get votes. And during the election year, there's a must go-to stop because he reaches so many. And some local newsmakers. And I'll walk through these, and I want to save a little time for some questions. Royce West is right here in Dallas. And say he is a state senator, a longtime attorney, and I met him. How? Well, first when I got here to Dallas, because he was one of the first black people who I met. And he has his own law firm. He also works closely with Tom Joyner. And he also has been influential in helping to lay the groundwork for education in this city with the University of North Texas, Dallas, and the Dallas College of Law downtown in Dallas. Yes?
Is he in any way related to Kanye West?
No. They got the same name, right? No relation at all, and for the same thing. I did meet many years ago Kanye West's mom before she died. Yes. Let me talk a little bit about this, and then we'll open it in. I want to go through another section real quick, and then I'll open it up to some more questions. I want to talk a little bit about the first ladies of the black press, particularly those who cover the black press. Right? And so let me tell you, the White House is one of the most coveted beats that a reporter could have. Why do you think that is, right? You're a small group of folks on a daily basis who can have access to the President of the United States and every major U.S. official in this country. So it's a very coveted beat, and only a handful of black people have done that job, and certainly an even smaller number of black women. These 2 women are trailblazers, Alice Dunnigan and Ethel Payne. So let me see if we're going to try to bounce over here real quick and show you this short clip.
Oh my, this morning we are celebrating 2 pioneers in journalism that you might not have heard of. The White House Correspondents Association is honoring Alice Dunnigan and Ethel Payne with the creation of a Lifetime Achievement Award in their names. They were the first black women to be members of the White House Press Corps back in the day. Dunnigan died back in 1983, Payne in 1991. Tomorrow night, their families will accept the inaugural Dunnigan-Payne Prize for Lifetime Career Achievement at a dinner in Washington, D.C. We're all going. We spoke with family members about these remarkable women. In the middle of the 20th century, America was a segregated nation. Schools and transportation in the South were separated based on race, and so was the nation's press. Alice Dunnigan, the Kentucky-born granddaughter of slaves, was determined to fulfill her dream of becoming a journalist.
I am Alicia Dunnigan, and Alice Dunnigan was my grandmother.
By the time she reached her 30s, Dunnigan had a regular column for a local paper. but she wanted more.
She said the two strikes out against her was that she was black and that she was female.
She landed a job in Washington, D.C., writing for the Associated Negro Press, a wire service for black-owned papers. In 1947, Alice Dunnigan became the first female black reporter credentialed to cover the White House.
I am James Johnson Jr., and Ethel Lois Payne was my aunt.
For Ethel Payne, the path to journalism began when she was denied admission to law school because of the color of her skin.
You couldn't control your opportunities, so you had to be prepared for whatever opportunity came along. Writing for her was a natural, something she liked to do.
In 1951, Payne was hired as a Washington reporter for the Chicago Defender, one of the country's leading black newspapers at the time.
I don't give a hoot whether you're Democrat or Republican in this kind of job.
Dunnigan and Payne regularly attended President Dwight Eisenhower's news conferences.
Information on Medicare codes may be delayed until 1955.
In 1954, just 2 months after the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, Ethel Payne demanded to know whether Eisenhower would support a ban on segregation in interstate travel. Ike did not like that question.
I'd like to know if we can assume that we have administrative support in getting action.
Well, I don't know what right you say that you have to have administrative support. The administration is trying to do what it thinks to be really decent and just in this country.
The moment sparked headlines of its own.
White House Press Secretary Ron Ziegler stated frankly that he was ousted.
Ethel Payne later went on to become the first black female commentator at CBS News.
Blacks are any different from other groups of voters.
Payne and Dunnigan were as dedicated to family as they were to their work.
My aunt was a very good cook. I can't think of one thing because everything she touched was good.
She never too much talked about what she did. If you asked her, she would tell you. I remember talking to her one time, and we had finished dinner, and so she said, my doctor said I should stop smoking cigarettes, so now I smoke a pipe.
Their legacies live on in the work done by journalists of color today.
I have great feeling for how she inspired us as the next generation.
She knocked the door down. I marvel at all that she did and all that she was and all that she fought for.
Bravo, ladies, bravo. I have to say, I'm embarrassed.
How about that, right? So trailblazers, like some of you in this room right now, you have no idea where you may be in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. You may be one of these folks who are changing the stories and helping to craft the stories about your family, about your communities, about those issues that really mean a lot to you. So here's your challenge to you. I would say that April Ryan is now followed in the footsteps. She's covered 5 U.S. presidents as a White House correspondent. So a true trailblazer, her name carrying the mantle. I want to go back to this last section, and I'll share this. Those are some of the people. But what's my message? Figure out how to tell a story today. You all have tools that I could have never imagined. I wish I could have I had paper and pencil, and then a manual typewriter. You all have access to computers and cell phones and graphic design tools that are way beyond my imagination. Right? Where do you begin? Some of you have already said that you've asked your family members to tell you stories, to learn more about. Dog is just a cute dog because it always gets a reaction. But be curious, explore. Everything around you is an opportunity. Do not take advantage of what your family has to offer you, and particularly learning about your culture and your family and your history. Certainly, you can Google, use your librarian here to really find some of the research that's now available digitally. talk to other historians. Some of you have excellent faculty here and teachers who are willing to share their knowledge with you and help you, inspire you to tell stories. Think about what's interesting. You already are off to a wonderful start being at this great school that so many don't have this opportunity because you're learning language, you're learning culture, you're learning about the world around you, which is so important to helping you understand your story and tell the stories of others. Write. Some of you already said, if I haven't inspired you to create my little home sweet home or mystery in space, write. Use the tools that you have to tell stories. And think about these as projects in the days ahead as you're working with your teachers. What's your family story? Who are the people in your family or community you admire? How have Black journalists played a role in your life and maybe telling this story? This could be a nice little research project, even looking at some of the people in greater depth that I've shared with you today. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. May I have your attention? Just to finish this wonderful presentation, I would obviously like to thank Mr. Foote for what was an inspiring presentation. It was a personal story, but a personal story that in many ways reflects a national story, the story of a nation, with its pain at times, but also with its successes. And I think that's something that I take from this, that at times there is pain, at times there is success, and there's a lot of beauty as well in that story. And for me, it's also inspirational, hopefully for you, thinking that you can learn, you can fight, you can get ahead, you can do things in life. And for example, given Mr. Foote's background as a writer, as a journalist, hopefully that might have inspired some vocations in you, wanting to become journalists, wanting to become novelists, wanting to become writers in general. And so please join me in thanking Mr. Foote for a very, very interesting and inspiring story.